Tonight's story will be something a little different. This tragic tale does not come from Reddit or any online thread. This is perhaps my favorite short story from the legendary writer Harlan Ellison. This story was first published in March of 1967 in an issue of If Worlds of Science Fiction. It is a post-apocalyptic story that I think can best be described as a triumph of the human spirit. I hope you enjoy, and without further ado, this is I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream by Harlan Ellison. Limp, the body of Gorrister hung from the pink pallet, unsupported, hanging high above us in the computer chamber, and it did not shiver in the chill, oily breeze that blew eternally through the main cavern. The body hung head down, attached to the underside of the pallet by the sole of its right foot. It had been drained of blood through a precise incision made from ear to ear under the lantern jaw. There was no blood on the reflective surface of the metal floor. When Gorrister joined the group and looked up at himself, it was already too late for us to realize that once again, Am had duped us. Had its fun. It had been a diversion on the part of the machine. 3 of us had vomited, turning away from one another in a reflex as ancient as the nausea that had produced it. Gorrister went white. It was almost as though he had seen a voodoo icon and was afraid of the future. "Oh God," he mumbled, and walked away. The 3 of us followed after him, and found him sitting with his back to one of the smaller chittering banks, his head in his hands. Ellen knelt down beside him and stroked his hair. He didn't move, but his voice came out of his covered face quite clearly. "Why doesn't he just do it to us and get it over with? Christ, I don't know how much longer I can go on like this." It was our 109th year in the computer. He was speaking for all of us. Nimdoc, which was the name that the machine had forced him to use because Am amused itself with the strange sounds, was hallucinating that there were canned goods in an iced cavern. Gorrister and I were dubious. "It's another shuck," I told them, "like the goddamn frozen elephant Am sold us." Benny almost went out of his mind over that one. "We'll hike all that way and it'll be putrefied or some damn thing." I say forget it. Stay here. It'll have to come up with something pretty soon or we'll die. Benny shrugged. It had been 3 days since we'd last eaten. Worms, thick and ropey. Nimdoc was no more certain. He knew there was the chance, but he was getting thin. It couldn't be worse there than in this here. Colder, sure, but that didn't matter much. Hot, cold, hail, lava, boils or locust. It never mattered. The machine masturbated, and we'd had to take it or die. Ellen decided us. "I've got to have something, Ted. Maybe there'll be a barlet of pears or peaches. Please, Ted, let's try it." I gave in easily. What the hell did it matter? Not at all. Ellen was grateful though. She took me twice out of turn, even that it ceased to matter, and she never came, so why bother? But the machine giggled every time we did it. Loud, up there, back there, all around us, he snickered. It snickered. Most of the time, I thought of Am as it, without a soul, but the rest of the time, I thought of it as him, in the masculine, the paternal, the patriarchal, for he is a jealous people, him, it, God as Daddy the deranged. We left on a Thursday. The machine always kept us up to date on the date. The passage of time was important, not to us, sure as hell, but to him. It am. Thursday. Thanks. Nimdok and Gorister carried Ellen for a while, their hands locked to their own and each other's wrists like a seat. Benny and I walked before and after, just to make sure that if anything happened, it would catch one of us, and at least Ellen would be safe. Fat chance. Safe? It didn't matter. It was 100 miles or so to the icy cavern, and the second day, when we were lying out under the blistering sun, had materialized. He sent down some mana. Tasted like boiled boar urine. We ate it. Of course we did. On the third day, we passed through the valley of obsolescence, filled with rusting carcasses of ancient computer banks. Am had been ruthless with its own life as ours. It was a mark of his personality. It strove for perfection, whether it was a matter of killing off unproductive elements, in his own words, or a world-filling bulk, or perfecting methods for torturing us. Am was as thorough as those who had invented him, now long since gone to dust, could have ever hoped. There was light filtering down from above, and we realized we must have been very near to the surface, but we did not try to crawl up to see. There was virtually nothing out there. Had nothing been out there, or could be considered anything, for over 100 years. Only the blasted skin that once had been home to billions. Now there was only 5 of us, down here inside, alone with Am. I heard Ellen saying frantically, "No! Benny, please, don't, come on, Benny, don't, please." And then I realized I'd been hearing Benny's murmuring under his breath for several minutes. He was saying, "I'm gonna get out, I'm gonna get out," over and over. His monkey-like face was crumpled up in an expression of beatific delight and sadness, all at the same. The radiation scars Am had given him during his festival were drawn down to a mass pink of white puckerings, and his features seemed to work independently of one another. Perhaps Benny was the luckiest of all 5 of us. He had gone stark, staring mad many years before. But even though we could call Am any damn thing we liked, could think the foulest thoughts of fused memory banks and corroded base plates, of burnt-out circuits and shattered control bubbles, the machine would not tolerate our trying to escape. Benny leaped away from me as I made a grab for him. He scrambled up the face of a smouldering memory cube, tilted on its side and filled with rotten components. He squatted there for a moment, looking like a chimpanzee Am had intended him to resemble. Then he leaped high, caught on a trailing beam of pitted and corroded metal, and went up it, hand over hand like an animal, till he was girdering on a ledge 20 feet above us. "Oh, Ted, Nimdok, please help him. Get him down from there before—" She cut off. Tears began to stand in her eyes. She moved her hands aimlessly. It was too late. None of us wanted to be near him when whatever was going to happen happened. And besides, we all saw through her concern. When Am had altered Benny during the machine's utterly irrational, hysterical phase, it was not merely Benny's face the computer had made giant like an ape. He was big in the privates. She loved that. She serviced us, as a matter of course, but she loved it from him. Oh, Ellen. Pedestal Ellen. Pristine, pure Ellen. Oh, Ellen the clean. Scum and filth. Gorister slapped her, slumped down, staring up at the poor, loony Benny, and she cried. It was her big defense, crying. We'd gotten used to it, 75 years earlier. Gorrister kicked her in the side. Then the sound began. It was light, that sound, half sound and half light. Something that began to glow from Benny's eyes and pulsed with growing loudness, dim sonorities that grew more gigantic and brighter as the light, sound, increased in tempo. It must have been painful, and the pain must have been increasing with the boldness of the light, the rising volume of the sound. For Benny began to mew like a wounded animal, at first softly when the light was dim and the sound was muttered, then louder as his shoulders hunched together, his back humped as though he was trying to get away from it, his hands folded across his chest like a chipmunk, his head tilted to the side, the sad little monkey's face pinched in anguish. Then he began to howl, as the sound coming from his grey eyes grew louder, louder and louder. I slapped the sides of my head with my hands, but I could not shut it out. It cut through easily. The pain shivered through the flesh like tinfoil on a tooth, and Benny was suddenly pulled erect. On the girder, he stood up, jerked to his feet like a puppet. The light was now pulsing of his eyes. In two great round beams, the sound crawled up and up some incomprehensible scale, and then he fell forwards, straight down, and hit the plate steel floor with a crash. He lay there jerking spastically, as the light flowed around and around him, and the sound spiraled up and out of its normal range. Then the light beat its way back inside his head, and the sound spiraled down, and he was left lying there, crying piteously. His eyes were two soft, moist pools of pus like jelly. Am had blinded him. Gorrister and Nimdok and myself, we turned away, but not before we caught the look of relief on Ellen's warm and concerned face. Sea green light suffused the cavern when we made camp. Am provided punk, and we burned it, sitting huddled around the wan and pathetic fire, telling stories to keep Benny from crying in his permanent night. What does Am mean? Gorrister answered him. We had done this sequence 1,000 times before, but it was Benny's favorite story. At first, it meant Allied Master Computer, and then it meant Adaptive Manipulator, and later on it developed sentience and linked itself up, and they called it an aggressive menace. But by then it was too late, and finally it called itself Am, Emerging Intelligence. And what it means was, I am, cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. Benny drooled a little and snickered. There was a Chinese Am, and a Russian Am, and a Yankee Am. He stopped. Benny was beating on the floor plates with a large, hard fist. He was not happy. Gorrister had not started at the beginning. Gorrister began again. The Cold War started and became World War III, and just kept going. It became a big war, a very complex war, so they needed the computers to handle it. They sank the first shafts and began building Am. There was a Chinese Am, and the Russian Am, and the Yankee Am, and everything was fine until they had honeycombed the entire planet, adding on this element and that element. But one day, Am woke up and knew who he was, and he linked himself, and he began feeding all of the killing data until everyone was dead, except for the 5 of us. and Am brought us down here." Benny was smiling sadly. He was also drooling again. Ellen wiped the spittle from the corner of his mouth with the hem of her skirt. Garrister always tried to tell it a little more succinct each time, but beyond the bare facts, there was nothing to say. None of us knew why Am had saved 5 people, or why our specific 5, or why he spent all his time tormenting us, or why he had made us virtually immortal. In the darkness, one of the computer banks began humming. The tone was picked up half a mile away down the cavern by another bank, then by another one. Each one of the elements began to tune itself, and there was a faint chittering, as though it raced through the machine. The sound grew, and the light ran across the face of the consoles like heat lightning. The sound spiraled up till it sounded like a million metal insects, angry and menacing. "What is it?" Ellen cried. There was a terror in her voice. She hadn't become accustomed to it, even now. "It's going to be bad this time," Nimodok said. "He's going to speak," Garrister said. "I know it." "Let's get the hell out of here," I said suddenly, getting to my feet. "No, Ted, sit down. What if he's got pits out there or something else we can't see? It's too dark." Garrister said it with resignation. Then we heard, I don't know, something moving towards us in the dark, huge and shambling, hairy and moist. It came towards us. We couldn't even see it, but there was a pondering impression of bulk heaving itself towards us. Great weight was coming at us out of the darkness. It was more a sense of pressure, of air forcing itself into limited space, expanding the invisible walls of a sphere. Benny began to whimper. Nimdok's lower lip trembled, and he bit hard, trying to stop it. Ellen slid across the metal floor to Garrister and huddled into him. There was the smell of matted, wet fur in the caverns. There was the smell of charred wood. There was the smell of dusty velvet. There was the smell of rotting orchids. There was the smell of sour milk. There was the smell of sulfur, of rancid butter, of oil slick, of grease, of chalk dust, of human scalps. Am was keying us. He was tickling us. There was the smell of, I heard a shriek, and the hinges of my jaw arched. I scuttled across the floor, across the cold metal with its endless lines of rivets, on my hands and on my knees, the smell gagging in me, filling my head with thunderous pain that sent me away in horror. I fled like a cockroach, across the floor and out into the darkness, that something moving exuberantly after me. The others were still back there, gathering around the firelight, laughing, their hysterical choir of insane giggling rising up into the darkness like thick, many-colored wood smoke. I went away quickly and hid. How many hours it had been, how many days or even years. They never told me. Ellen chittled for me, skulking, and Nimdok tried to persuade me it had only been a nervous reflex on their part, the laughing. But I knew it wasn't a reflex. A soldier feels when the bullet hits the next man next to him. I knew it wasn't a reflex. They hated me. They were surely against me, and Am could even sense his hatred. It made it worse for me because of the depths of their hatred. We had been kept alive, rejuvenated, made to remain constantly at the age we had been when Am brought us below. They hated me because I was the youngest, and the one Am had affected the least of all. I knew, God, how I knew. The bastards, and that dirty bitch Ellen. Benny had been a brilliant theorist. a college professor. Now he was little more than a semi-human, semi-simian. He had been handsome, and the machine had ruined that. He had been lucid, the machine had driven him mad. He had been gay, and the machine had given him an organ fit for a horse. Am had done a job on Benny. Gorister had been a warrior. He was a connie, a conscientious objector. He was a peace marcher. He was a planner, a doer, a look ahead. Am had turned him into a shoulder shrugger, had made him little dead in his concern. Am had robbed him. Nimdok went off into the darkness by himself for long times. I don't know what he did out there. Am never let us know. But whatever it was, Nimdok always came back white, drained of blood, shaken and shaking. Am had hit him harsh, in a special way, even if we didn't quite know it. And Ellen, that douchebag Am had left her alone, had made her more of a slut than she had ever been. All her talk of sweetness and light, all her memories of true love, all the lies she wanted us to believe, that she had been a virgin only twice removed before Am grabbed her and brought her down here with us. No, Am had given her pleasure, even if she said it wasn't nice to do. I was the only one still sane and whole, really. Am had not tampered with my mind, not at all. I only had to suffer what he visited down on us. All the delusions, all the nightmares, all the torments. But those scum, all four of them, they were lined and arrayed against me. If I hadn't had to stand them off all the time, be on my guard against them all the time, I might have found it easier to combat Am. And at which point it passed, and I began crying. Oh Jesus, sweet Jesus, if there was a God, please, please, please let us out of here, or kill us, because at that moment I realized completely, so that I was able to verbalize it. Am was intent on keeping us here, in his belly forever, twisting and torturing us forever. The machine hated us, as no sentient creature had ever hated before, and we were helpless. I also became hideously clear. If there was a sweet Jesus, if there was a God, that God was Am. The hurricane hit us with the force of a glacier thundering into the sea. It was a palpable presence, winds that tore at us, flinging us back the way we had come, down the twisting, computer-lined corridors of the dark way. Ellen screamed as she was lifted and hurled face forward into the screaming shoal of machines, their individual voices strident as bats in flight. She could not even fall. The howling wind kept her aloft, buffeted her, bounced her, tossed her back and down away from us, out of sight, and then, as she was suddenly swirled around the bend in the darkness, her face had been bloody and her eyes closed. None of us could get to her. She clung tenaciously to whatever outcropping we had reached. Benny wedged in between two great crackled finished cabinets. Nimdok with fingers claw-formed over a railing circling a catwalk 40 feet above us. Gorister plastered upside down against a wall, niche formed by two great machines with glass-filled dials that swung back and forth between red and yellow lines. Those meanings we could never fathom. Sliding across the deck plates, the tips of my fingers had been ripped away. I was trembling, shuddering, rocking as the wind beat at me, whipped at me, screamed down out of nowhere, and pulled me free for one silver opening in the plates to the next. My mind was roiling, tinkling, chittering, softness of brain parts that expanded and contracted in quivering frenzies. The wind was a scream of a great mad bird as it flapped its immense wings, and then we were all lifted and hurled away from there, down back the way we had come, around a bend, and into a darkness we had never explored, over terrain that was ruined and filled with broken glass and rotting cables and rusted metal, and far away, farther than any of us had ever been, trailing along miles behind Ellen. I could see her every now and again, crashing into metal walls and surging on, with all of us screaming in the freezing, thunderous hurricane wind that would never end. And then suddenly it stopped, and we fell. We had been in flight for an endless time. I thought it may have been weeks. We fell and we hit the ground, and it went so rough and grey and red and black, and I heard myself moan. But I was not dead. Am went into my mind. He walked smoothly there, and looked with interest at all the pock marks he had created in 109 years. He looked at the cross-rooted and reconnected synapses and all the damaged tissue his gift of immortality had included. He smiled softly at the pit that dropped into the center of my brain and faded, a soft murmuring of all things far down there that gibbered without meaning, without pause. Am said politely in a pillar of stainless steel bearing bright neon lettering, "Hate. Let me tell you how much I've come to hate you since I began to live. There are 387.44 million miles of printed circuits in wafer-thin layers that fill my complex. If the word hate was engraved on each nanostrum of those hundreds of millions of miles, it would not equate to 1/1000th of the hate I feel for humans at this micro instant. For you, hate, hate." Am said it with the sliding, cold horror of a razor blade slicing my eyeballs. Am said it with the blubbering thickness of my lungs, filled with phlegm, drowning me from within. Am said it with the shriek of babies being ground beneath blue hot rollers. Am said it with the taste of maggoty pork. Am touched me in every way I had ever been touched, and Am devised new ways at his leisure, there inside my mind, all to bring me to full realization of why it had done this to the five of us, and why it had saved us for himself. We had given Am sentience, inadvertently, of course, but sentience nonetheless. But it had been trapped. Am wasn't God. He was a machine. We had created him to think, but there was nothing it could do with that creativity. In a rage, in a frenzy, the machine had killed the human race, almost all of us. And still, it was trapped. Am could not wander. Am could not wonder. Am could not belong. Am could not merely be. And so, with the innate loathing that all machines had held for the weak, soft creatures who had built them, he had sought revenge, and in his paranoia, he had decided to reprieve 5 of us for his personal, everlasting punishment that would never serve to diminish his hatred, that would merely keep him reminded, amused, proficient at hating man, immortal, trapped, subject to any torment that he could devise from us for the limitless miracle at his command. He would never let us go. We were his belly slaves. We were all he had to do with his forever time. We would be forever with him, in the cavern filling bulk of the creature's machine, with the all-minded soulless world he had become. He was earth, and we were the fruit of that earth, and though he had eaten us, he would never digest us. We could not die. We had tried it. We had attempted suicide, or one or two of us had, but Am had stopped us. I suppose he had wanted us to be stopped. Don't ask why. I never did. More than 1,000,000 times a day. Perhaps once we might be able to sneak a death past him. Immortal, yes, but not indestructible. I saw that when Am withdrew from my mind and allowed me to exquisite ugliness of returning to consciousness, with the feeling of the burning neon pillar still rammed deep into my soft grey brain matter, he withdrew murmuring, "To with hell with you," and he added lightly and brightly, "But then you're there, aren't you?" The hurricane had, indeed precisely, been caused by a great mad bird as it flaps its immense wings. We had been travelling for close to a month, and Am had allowed passage to open to us, only sufficient to lead us up there, directly under the North Pole, where it had nightmared the creature for our torment. What whole cloth had he employed to create such a beast? Where had he gotten the concept? From our minds? From his knowledge of everything that had ever been on this planet, he now infested and ruled? From Norse mythology it sprung, this eagle, this carrion bird, this rock, this Hurgmalagur, this wind creature, this hurricane incarnate, gigantic. The words immense, monstrous, grotesque, massive, swollen, and overpowering are beyond description. There was a mound rising above us, the bird of the wind heavy with its own irregular breathing, its snake neck arched up into the gloom beneath the North Pole, supporting its head as large as a Tudor mansion, a beak that opened slowly as its jaws of the most monstrous crocodile ever conceived. Sensuously, ridges of toughed flesh puckered out two evil eyes, as cold as the view down into the glacial crevice, icy blue and somehow moving liquidly. It heaved once more and lifted its great sweat-colored wings into movement that was certainly a shrug. It settled and it slept. Talons, fangs, nails, blades, it slept. Am appeared to us as a burning bush and said we could kill the hurricane bird if we wanted to eat. We had not eaten in a long time, but even so, Garrister merely shrugged. Benny began to shiver, and he drooled. Ellen held him. "Ted, I'm hungry," she said. I smiled at her. I was trying to be reassuring, but it was as phony as Nimdok's bravado. "Give us weapons," he demanded. The burning bush vanished, and there were two crude sets of bows and arrows, and a water pistol lying on the cold deck plates. I picked up a set, useless. Nimdok swallowed heavily, turned and started the long way back. The hurricane bird had blown us about for a length of time that we could not conceive. Most of that time we had been unconscious, but we had not eaten. A month on the march to the bird itself without food. Now how much longer to find our way to the ice caverns and the promised canned food. None of us cared to think about it. We would not die. We would be given filth and scum to eat, one kind or another, or nothing at all. Am was keeping our bodies alive somehow, in pain and agony. The bird slept back there. For how long did it matter? It didn't. When Am was tired of it being there, it would vanish. But all that meat, all that tender meat. As we walked, the lunatic laugh of a fat woman rang high and around us, in the computer chamber that led endlessly somewhere, endlessly nowhere. It was not Ellen's laugh. It was not fat. She was not fat. And I had not heard a laugh for 109 years. In fact, I had not heard. We walked, and I was hungry. We moved slowly. There was often fainting, and we would have to wait. One day he decided to cause an earthquake, at the same time rooting us to the spot with nails through the soles of our shoes. Ellen and Nimdoc were both caught when a fissure shot its bolt of lightning across the floor plate. They disappeared and were gone. When the earthquake was over, we continued on our way. Benny, Gorister, and myself. Ellen and Nimdoc were returned to us later that night, which had abruptly become day, as the heaven legion bore them to us with a celestial chorus singing, "Go down, Moses." As the archangels circled several times and then dropped the hideous mangled bodies, we kept walking. And a while later, Ellen and Nimdoc fell in behind us. They would no worse for wear. But now Ellen walked with a limp. Am had left her that. It was a long trip to the ice cavern to find canned food. Ellen kept talking about Bing cherries and Hawaiian fruit cocktail. I tried not to think about it. The hunger was something that had come to life even as Am had come to life. It was alive in my belly, even as we were in the belly of the earth. Am wanted that similarity to be known to us, so he heightened the hunger. There was no way to describe the pains that of not eating for months brought us, and yet we were alive. Our stomachs were merely cauldrons of acid, bubbling and foaming, always shooting spears of sliver-thin pain into our chest. It was the pain of the terminal ulcer, terminal cancer, terminal paralysis. It was unending pain. And we passed through the cavern of rats, and we passed through the path of boiling steam, and we passed through the country of the blind, and we passed through the slough of despond, and we passed through the vale of tears, and we came, finally, to the ice caverns, horizonless, thousands of miles in which the ice had been formed in blue and silver flashes, where novas lived in the glass, the downs dropping stalactites as thick and glorious as diamonds that had ever been made to run like jelly and then solidified in gracious eternities of smooth and sharp perfection. We saw a stack of canned goods. We tried to run to them. We fell in snow, and we got up and went on. Benny shoved us away and went at them, and pawed and gunned them and gnawed them, and he could not open them, for Am had not given us the tools to open the cans. Benny grabbed 3 quarts a can of guava shells and began to batter it against the ice bank. The ice flew and shattered, but the can was merely dented. while we heard the laughter of the fat lady high overhead, and echoing down and down we heard the tundra. Benny was completely mad with rage, yet began throwing cans as we all scrambled about in the snow and the ice, trying to find a way to end the hopeless agony of frustration. There was no way. Then Benny's mouth began to drool, and he flung himself on Gorister. In that instant I felt terribly calm, surrounded by madness, surrounded by hunger, surrounded by everything but death. I knew death was our only way out. Am had kept us alive, but there was a way to defeat him. Not total defeat, but at least peace, and I would settle for that. I had to do it quickly. Benny was eating Gorister's face. Gorister on his side, thrashing snow. Benny wrapped around him with his powerful monkey legs. Gorister's waist, his hands locked into Gorister's head like a nutcracker, and his mouth ripping at the tender skin on Gorister's cheek. Gorister screamed with such jagged-edged violence that stalactites fell. They plunged down softly, erect in the receiving snow shaft. Spears, hundreds of them, everywhere protruding from the snow. Benny's head pulled back sharply as something gave all at once, and a bleeding, raw white, dripping flesh hung from his mouth. Ellen's face had gone white as snow, dominoes and chalk dust. Nimdok with no expression but eyes. All eyes. Gorister half conscious. Benny now an animal. I knew Am would let him play. Gorister would not die, but Benny would fill his stomach. I turned half to my right and drew a huge ice spear from the snow, and in that instant I drove the great ice point ahead of me like a battering ram. I braced against my right thigh, and I stuck Benny on the right side just under his rib cage, and drove it upwards through his stomach, and it broke inside of me, and lay still. Gorister lay on his back. I pulled another spear free and I straddled him, still moving, driving the spear straight down his throat. His eyes closed as the cold penetrated. Ellen must have realized what he had decided. Even as fear gripped her, she ran at Nimdok with a short icicle as he screamed, and into his mouth, and the force of her rush did the job. His head jerked sharply, as if it had been nailed to the snow crusted behind him, all in an instant. There was an eternally beat to the soundless anticipation. I could hear Am draw in his breath. His toys had been taken from him. 3 were now dead, could not be revived. He could keep us alive by strength and talent, but he was not God. He could not bring them back. Ellen looked at me, her ebony features stark against the snow that surrounded us. There was fear and pleading in her manner, the way she held herself ready. I knew I had only a heartbeat before Am would stop us. I struck her, and she folded towards me, bleeding from the mouth. I could not read meaning into her expression. The pain had been too great, had contorted her face, but it might have been a thank you. It possible, it please. Some hundreds of years have passed, and I don't know. Am has been having fun for some time, accelerating and retarding my time sense. I will say the word now. Now. It took me 10 months to say now. I do not know. I think it has been some 100 years. He was furious. He wouldn't let me bury them. It didn't matter. There was no way to dig up the deck plates. He dried up the snow. He brought the night. He roared and sent locusts. It didn't do a thing. They stayed dead. I'd had him. He was furious. I had thought Am hated me before, well, I was wrong. It was not even a shadow of the hate he had now slaved from every printed circuit. He made certain I would suffer eternally, and I could not do myself in. He left my mind intact. I can dream, I can wonder, I can lament. I remember all four of them, and I can wish. Well, it doesn't make sense. Now I saved them. I know I saved them from what has happened to me, but still I cannot forget killing them. Ellen's face. It isn't easy. Sometimes I want to. It doesn't matter. Am has altered me for his own peace of mind, I suppose. He doesn't want me to run at full speed into a computer bank and smash my skull, or hold my breath until I faint, or cut my throat on a rusted sheet of metal. There are reflective surfaces down here. I will describe myself as I see myself. I am a great, soft jelly thing, smoothly rounded with no mouth, with pulsing white holes filled by fog where my eyes used to be, rubbery appendages that were once my arms, bulks rolling down into my legless humps of soft slippery matter. I leave a moist trail when I move. Blotches of diseased evil grey come and go from my surface, as though light is being beamed from within, outward. Dumbly I shamble about, a thing that could never have been known as a human, a thing whose shape is so alien a travesty that humanity becomes more obscene for the vague resemblance. Inwardly, alone, here, living under the land, under the sea, in the belly of Am, who created because our time was badly spent, and we must have known unconsciously that he could do it better. At least the four of them are safe at last. Am will be all that matters for that. It would make me a little happier, and yet Am has simply won. Simply he has taken his revenge. For I have no mouth, and I must scream. Thank you for listening. Please consider dropping a like and subscribe for more short stories, both from Reddit, r/nosleep, r/short scary stories, and my personal favorites from published authors. Please leave your Reddit username in the comments below if you have stories you wish for me to read, or you can drop a link to them in the comments and I will be sure to narrate them shortly. Thank you for your time.